Hello, English 240 students. I'm actually back in Huntington, West Virginia. Talking to you from my office. Normally, I put up instructional videos at the beginning of the week and then closer to the end of the week. Sometimes on Thursday, if I feel like there's something you should know before you hit the discussion board, and sometimes after the discussion board as sort of a recap of some of the things that you've already talked about and some things that you actually might still consider. I thought you all did a pretty excellent job with the discussion board. One thing I noted is that several of you, your ideas are really solid. You're clearly engaging with the text, but you need to show me just a little bit more. Make sure that you are, if not quoting from passages from the text, clearly referencing passages from the text. I don't want to get responses that could have been written from a study guide. Or from Spark Notes. And I don't think you were doing that. I'm not accusing anybody of anything. I thought they were all really intelligent, but show me what you know. Show me the care that you're taking. It doesn't take too much to literally copy and paste a quotation from something we've read into your discussion board so that I know you're doing the work and doing it well and rigorously. All right, a couple of things that you guys talked about that I thought are really, I'm really distracted by my Velvet Elvis behind me, but I gotta try to ignore that right now. That was a student gift. Anyway, a couple of things that you talked about, specifically with Frederick Douglass. When I asked that question about instruments and techniques of power that were revealed through that. This is really important stuff because it comes up again and again and again in the literature. In fact, and a lot of you really nailed it. You explored quite a few of the important elements that I want you to take a look at. Generally speaking, when you look at how oppression works at a cultural level, one thing I tell my students is to think about what you already know about oppression on a personal level. In a classroom, I'd say, how many people here know someone who is emotionally abused in a relationship? And everybody raises their hands. One of the tragedies, and this isn't specifically gender specific. Women can emotionally abuse men, men emotionally abuse women, and physically abuse them. But that abuse usually follows a kind of pattern. There are a couple of things that people do. Obviously, there's physical threat, and a lot of you, that's really obvious in Douglass, that there's physical threat. There's also creation of dependency, which a lot of you got, and that can be done through the keeping and withholding of food in the text. But in a relationship, that might be more about, somebody withholding money, or I had a friend whose husband would pull the spark plugs out of her car before he left, and that creation of dependency and isolation, and entrapment. So people are sort of they don't have freedom of movement. Again, obvious element in life of an American slave. So there are a number of things that are really obvious that are happening there that you can look at. One of the things that a few of you mentioned, but I'd like to call a little bit more attention to, is this act of surveillance. And really what we're looking at here is what a theorist called Michel Foucault would call a carceral network. And what a carceral society is one that controls its citizens through the same techniques you basically use in a prison system. And Foucault talks about the panopticon, the system of seeing, where everybody is being watched all the time. And certainly we get a really immediate example of that in chapter 3 when Douglass talks about the slave who runs into a man on the road who asks him, so what do you think of your owner? Like, is it a good master? And the slave, thinking that he is speaking sort of privately to someone, says, actually, no, I'm not very happy. And then that person goes on and tells the master, and then the next thing, the slave is sold downriver, which was the most terrifying thing you could do because you don't want to be working in the 100-degree weather down in Georgia. As bad as things were in Maryland, historically, you were much better off working in Maryland than in the Deep South. So there was So, and that's another thing. So, the surveillance actually leads people to constantly having to modify their behavior, even if the master is not around. So, the master is around even when it's not. This is true in all societies, by the way. Um, all societies, to some degree, are carceral. And I point out to students that you've probably been filmed today if you've left the house at all, at least once. If you stopped to get gas in your car, you've been filmed. If you walked into a convenience store or a grocery store, you've been filmed. If you walked into the English department at Marshall University, you've been filmed. And all those cameras are there to remind you that you are being watched and that you have to behave. And gossip can function this way on a social level. When you do something and somebody talks about you and that person talks to someone else, that's all behavioral modification designed to keep people in line and keep people in place. And of course, slavery is an extreme example of this. Some other things that you guys are talking about that I thought really fascinating. You spent some time, a lot of you, engaging with that question about masculinity. And this is, again, something that's going to come up continually in the readings. It is really difficult to separate issues of race from issues of gender. And that some of you are making that connection is great. I mean, it's not good that there is a connection, but I'm glad that you're starting to see these connections between how the ways we oppress one group are actually quite similar to the ways we oppress another. And that some of it is just insidious and cultural. It's not even necessarily with intent. Certainly in slavery there's intent. But the way we absorb attitudes about masculinity and about about women and about how we should treat ourselves and others and sexuality, these are all cultural things that we learn, and we start learning from a very early age through media, through television, through billboards, through magazines. And back then, you have this incredible example. So why does Frederick Douglass, connect masculinity to violence and freedom to violence? Well, that's his example. Power. People in power exert violence. So when he says, I've told you about how a man became a slave, now I'm going to show you how a slave became a man, and his story is all about beating the crap out of somebody, which, admittedly, is really enjoyable. No one's ever shed a tear for Mr. Covey getting the snot kicked out of him, is also in some ways terrifying, because our country is still struggling with this horrible connection between masculinity and violence, and power and violence. And we just seem to continually become a more violent culture. And we see the seeds of it in these very early, in slavery, where violence was used to oppress a massive group of people. It's also troubling that slavery also establishes some attitudes about gender towards women. And this is a literal commodification of a woman's body, so that the body can be sold, it can be taken away, it can be possessed. When we talk about emasculation of the American slaves, one of the ways African American slaves were emasculated was their wives and their children were taken from them. But even that phrasing asserts and affirms this idea that a woman is ever owned to begin with. And of course, we're talking hundreds of years ago, but those attitudes are still at play right now. And again, inextricably associated with issues of race, where an African-American woman's body has been culturally commodified even more so than a white woman's body because of issues of power and control. So these are just some of the really important issues that you guys handled so well in your responses, and I just wanted to affirm for you that you're all on the right track with them. I already talked a little bit about double consciousness, so I'm not going to revisit that today, except to briefly talk about Toni Morrison's Home, which very few of you have mentioned. The reason I added that very difficult reading is, and it's sort of out of context because she's giving a speech to a bunch of people at a conference, is because I'm interested in the way she talks about this idea of what it means to be an African American writer. And what she talks about is she wants to be able to write recognizably as African American from a racialized perspective. And yet she's really struggling. How do I do that? She's asking herself. without reaffirming the very stereotypes that I'm trying to avoid. And so she talks about it as a home that she's trying to completely rebuild. Um, and but what are you rebuilding it from? It's still these materials. It's so hard. And this speaks back to this issue of internalization that you're all talking about. We talked about the gaze, but what happens when the gaze becomes internalized? What happens when these attitudes that other people have presented to you? It's one thing to be seen as a problem, but what happens when you start seeing yourself that way? Um, we all get up in the mirror and look in the mirror every day, and what we see is ourselves, but it's very difficult for us not to see ourselves through others' eyes. Am I too fat? Am I too this? Am I too that? And so this self-loathing starts to take effect based on a cultural standard that we've internalized. And so we are all taught to hate ourselves a little bit. And think about how much more intense that is. I mean, I feel that, and I am a privileged white guy from the suburbs with a PhD. When you add issues of race and gender and sexuality to that equation, that self-loathing, of course, becomes intensely manifest, and it becomes compounded. Um, so these are some of the issues that we're going to keep talking about. We're definitely going to keep talking about double consciousness, the gaze, masculinity, and how power and oppression works throughout the semester. And you're going to see many examples of that. Which makes all of our readings sound incredibly depressing. But there are these moments that are incredibly liberating. Like I said, it's unfortunate that Douglas learns to connect freedom with violence, but that does not in any way diminish the incredible courage or the satisfaction that we take in his moment of exuberant freedom when he stands up for himself in the face of all of this, and shockingly doesn't die as a result of it. He wins. In these moments of victory that take such incredible courage, we will see throughout the semester in this incredibly revolutionary and powerful writing. And it's great to have you all on board, and I'm loving what I'm reading. Worked about halfway through the discussion board, and I will continue to do so. See you soon.